Continuing our series of interviews to commemorate the 40th anniversary of Home Rule, today we have convened for this discussion Mayor Vincent C. Gray, Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, former Mayor Sharon Pratt, and first chairman of the City Council, Sterling Tucker. Just to give you a recap, in our previous interviews, we discussed the history of governance in the city, dating back to the Compromise of 1790, the Residence Act of 1790, and the various modifications to the district's charter by Congress. Interviews with the surviving members of the first City Council provided us with insight into the role and challenges of officials elected in the first election under Home Rule in 1974. Today, our panelists will take a look at the past 40 years, address some of the contemporary issues we face under Home Rule 40 years later, and provide us with a forecast of expectations of full and complete self-determination in the near future. So let's begin. Mayor Gray will respond to the first question, followed by our other distinguished panel members. So, Mr. Mayor, during the first 40 years since the first election under Home Rule, what's your assessment of our progress in managing the district within the framework of the current governance structure? And where do we go from here for full budgetary autonomy, self-determination, and complete control of the district?
Well, I think it's imperative that we remember that we are a very young government. 40 years is not very old at all. In fact, every other city and state in America is far more mature, at least from the perspective of years, than we are. So I think we've made absolutely phenomenal progress in developing the city to the point that it has gotten to. You know, we've hit some bumps in the road. We had a difficult time 20 or so years ago when we wound up with a financial control board, but that's not unusual. You know, that happened in New York, that happened in Cleveland. If you look at the challenges now in Detroit that they're faced with. But, you know, rather than dwell on what happened during that period, let's look at what happened in the aftermath in the years since. We have I think, made phenomenal progress. We've had 16 consecutive years of balanced budgets. We now have a fund balance in the city that is unprecedented. We have $1.75 billion in the bank at this stage, which is earning interest and helping to continue to grow our reputation as a very responsible jurisdiction. I think that also, you know, argues the question of why is it that we don't have control of our own budget? Why is it that we don't have control of our own laws in the District of Columbia? Why is it that our Congresswoman doesn't have a vote in the House of Representatives? And why haven't we been accorded the opportunity for statehood? Again, with the track record we've had with our budgets, we've made, you know, I think a phenomenal impression on lots of people about how stable this city is and about how well managed the city is. It's ludicrous that we have to continue to send our laws up to the Congress to be approved when in fact they've been given thoughtful consideration by our council, signed by me. If it were anywhere else, that would be the end of the process. No one would have to be subjected to this kind of you know, degradation, in my opinion, and that is having to send our laws to be approved by a body that can barely function itself. So, you know, we've made phenomenal progress. You know, clearly for me, statehood is ultimately the goal. It would be great to have budget autonomy, to be able to control the decision making around our own dollars. Same thing with our local laws. Certainly to have a vote for our Congresswoman would be important, but to me the ultimate goal is statehood, and that's what we need to continue to strive to achieve.
Excellent. Speaking of Congress, Congresswoman Norton, your thoughts on that?
Well, if you look at the district over the 40 years of its life, and remember that this wasn't the first time we had home rule. The Republicans gave us home rule in the 19th century. And when the Democrats came into power after Reconstruction, they took it away, and we were 150 years without home rule. But you look at the last 40 years of the District of Columbia, you will be hard-pressed to see any difference between the District of Columbia and other big cities. They all experienced the flight of residents. They all went through tough times. But they haven't all come back the way the district has. They haven't all had a budget that is the example for the country. They don't all have a budget that beyond its that they don't all have a rainy day fund that they don't even have to go into. What holds the district back more than anything else now is the Congress of the United States. No one could have doubted the first day of Home Rule that the district knew how to govern itself. And it is puzzling to know why the Congress wants to hold on to the district. Frankly, it doesn't even look at the district's budget anymore. I've been able to get the budget hearing, which used to be very extensive when I came into Congress, eliminated. So there's no budget hearing. The only way the budget becomes, and that's what they have to pass, our budget raised in the District of Columbia, but they look at it to see whether they want to attach something to it. So they look at it for purposes having nothing to do with us. If you would ask the Congress, is there a reason why the Congress feels it should maintain at least some control over the government, most members of the Congress would lose their voice at this point. But this is the riddle that the district will have to solve, and the only way to solve that is by residents themselves doing what they have always done, insisting on their rights. And we've just had the first Senate hearing ever on statehood for the District of Columbia. So statehood may not be around the corner, but it remains the goal of the district. We'll take anything we can get as quick as we can get it. The district at the first was given a school board. It didn't turn it back because it didn't have home rule. It realized it had to take that, run with it, and say, you better give us the rest of it. The district got home rule. That home rule is very incomplete. And the most incomplete thing about it is the budget we raise on our own and then have to go to the Congress to get ultimately approved. It costs us money because we have to go to some place which has nothing to do with our budget.
And
so
that's exactly one of the issues we'll be discussing in this this program today. But we're going to move on to Mayor Pratt. Give us your thoughts on that same issue.
Well, I agree with both of them. I think Mayor Gray gave a beautiful outline of how well the District of Columbia has done in its short history of being this sovereign entity, or not even sovereign entity, that's the issue, is it not? But as in terms of home rule for the last 40 years, and I think Congresswoman Norton asks the appropriate question. Why is it that Congress fights it? Because we see with the inception of the country that when the Federalist Papers were written, Madison made it very clear there was no intention that this federal city would remain under the jurisdiction of Congress indefinitely, that this community would have full enfranchisement, because that was the whole spirit and purpose of America. But we know that, like America, with all of her promise and all of her dreams and all of her glory, that we in the District of Columbia, this capital in particular, reflect an enormous contradiction about this country. The contradiction of being an expression of the American dream, and the contradiction of the country around the American dilemma, because that compromise that was effected by Thomas Jefferson, Madison, and Hamilton to bring the capital to Washington, D.C. had everything to do with the American dilemma of slavery. They wanted the capital in a slave-holding community. And I think that troubled beginning has stayed with us throughout our evolution, in spite of all of the finer expressions of the city. And I think that dilemma, unfortunately, plays itself out in partisan politics, even racial politics, in the 21st century.
Okay. And Chairman Tucker, you'll...
Well, I would only add that when Lyndon Johnson appointed the first city council, after he tried to get legislation through and couldn't do so, he became very creative and reorganized the district government as though it were a department of the federal government. And then he told the first appointed members, now act like you've been elected. And so maybe that's what we should do, is begin acting and functioning like we're a state. And then perhaps they'll see that we ought to get our full representation to Congress. I mean, that was a fact. That's what he said to the first council: act as if you're elected, even though you're appointed. All the issues that once were raised, they're gone. There are no more arguments. You know, we've overcome every issue that they've raised. The one last issue is what they're hanging on to, is the fact that the Constitution says, you know, that we are part of the federal system. That's the last argument, and that's what we have to overcome now.
There's more ahead. We'll be right back after this. And so we're back with our panel discussion. We're going to start with the next round of questions, and we'll begin again with Mayor Gray. Mayor Gray, what are the strengths and weaknesses of the Home Rule Act of 1973?
Well, I think the strengths are also the weaknesses. They gave us the opportunity to be able to manage our city to an extent. It's an oxymoron to me to call something limited home rule. Either you have home rule or you don't. And clearly we don't have full home rule. I think the ability to have elected officials in the District of Columbia, to have an elected mayor, to have an elected council, those are certainly strengths. But again, inherent in that are the weaknesses that are imposed, the limitations that are imposed upon those who are elected officials. A council that anywhere else would be able to have final approval of a budget. A mayor that would be in a position to be able to propose laws to the council, and then once you have made decisions between the council, the legislative body, and the executive, being able to move forward. So I think, again, it's wonderful that we've been able to achieve the progress we have. But frankly, after 40 years of this, it is time for the Congress to let go, to let the District of Columbia, which I think amply has demonstrated our capacity to manage ourselves. And frankly, even if we hadn't, which we have, but even if we hadn't, what about some of these other jurisdictions that don't have their management authority taken away from them? Even though some of the decision making is highly questionable. So again, inherent in where we are at this point is the strength of being able to have elected officials who I think by and large have managed the city in a very responsible way over 40 years. But again, to have the constraints that are imposed upon us are really unconscionable.
And Congresswoman Norton, strengths and weaknesses of the Home Rule Act of 1973?
Well, giving the district incomplete home rule created more problems than it solved. I agree with the mayor. The most important provision of the Home Rule Act is the elected mayor. So the people of the District of Columbia get to elect their own mayor and city council. So we have local governance. And the fact is, as much as the Congress interferes, and we now have been able to get all of the so-called riders off of the appropriation except one, and that's the one that would allow us to spend our own money, by the way, on abortions for poor women. But the issue with incomplete home rule is that the district is left with a premium that it must pay to Wall Street because the budget has to go to the Congress. And everyone knows that the Congress has really nothing to do with that budget. They wouldn't dare look into the budget. The mayor's and the council's legislation that has to lie over in the Congress is a tremendous weakness, even though nobody overturns it. So you see, these are built in impediments that, to the credit of the mayors, and two of them are here, have never gotten in the way of their governance, but do stand in the way of efficiency for the district government and do spend time of the Congress that should be spent on national legislation.
Mayor Pratt?
Well, I agree with both of them. I think that the frustration of our limited home rule government lies in the fact that it is at odds with everything that shaped the creation of this country. In our system of government in the United States of America, it was that the individual would have a level of sovereignty, as with the jurisdiction in which residents or citizens lived, would have a sovereignty, and that no one should have to be under the thumb of a overreaching federal interest. At that time, there was a resistance of the monarchy of King George III. This would not be visited upon anybody who lived in America. And that's what we have, though. We live in the United States of America. We pay taxes to the federal government. We serve the United States. We have in the past, in military service. And yet, at any time, any member of Congress can interfere with our jurisdiction, and there is no sovereignty. There is no finality to any of it in terms of our expression in this country. And that is offensive to everything that is true to America. And so it's sort of, I guess I'm saying it another way, exactly what Eleanor and the mayor, the Congresswoman and the mayor have said. It is the absence of that final word, the absence of sovereignty, that anyone at any time can interfere in the will of the people of the District of Columbia.
And Chairman Tucker.
I can give you an illustration. I was on the appointed city council, and before we had an election, there was an issue about a highway being built right down through the city, across the city, so that we can get people in from the suburbs in and out faster. And I was opposed to it. And I got a call from the White House asking me to support it. I told them that I would not support it, and I offered to resign from the council because of it. They asked me not to resign, and we were able to manage that issue at that time. Once I became elected, I didn't get calls from the White House asking me to vote for election. And that's just a good example, because I had the support of the people. I had the power of the people behind me. My view is that what we need to do is push the envelope as fast and as hard as we can, push it as far as we can. If they don't like it, then they have to deal with it. Act as if we're a state and push it. Look to our possibilities and not to our limitations. Not concentrate on our limitations, but on our possibilities, and build and organize in terms of that kind of a future.
One of the most important things I think we need to recognize is that we have more people living in the District of Columbia now than the entire state of Wyoming, the entire state of Vermont. What needs to happen is that people need to increasingly recognize the power of advocacy that we have, because you get enough people together with a consistent voice on sovereignty, as Mayor Pratt put it, in the city. I don't think there's any way that it can be stopped.
Well, I think we do need the support of the country. And that is the great limitation we have. It's very difficult sitting here in the district in the eye of the storm for people to even know that we don't have the same rights they have. And one thing they don't know, and I believe that if we found a way to get this one figure out, we could then get the attention of the country, and that is $12,000 per resident is what the district pays in federal income taxes, and that is more per resident, per capita, than any residents pay to the federal government. In other words, taxation without representation does not mean that we pay some taxes. It means we pay more taxes than anyone else and get less of our rights than all of the rest of the country. I'd just like to get some hashtag out there about $12,000 per resident more than you pay, and maybe we get their attention.
As you can see, there's far more to discuss on this issue. It's a fascinating topic. We'll be right back after this. So I'm going to jump in with the next question to keep the discussion going. And I'll start with Mayor Gray. Where do you see us in the next 10, 15, 20, or 40 years in the struggle for home rule?
I have to be optimistic about the opportunity to achieve progress. You know, I'm not an incrementalist by nature. I'd love to go right to statehood, but the likelihood of that happening is probably not substantial. But I think we are moving in the right direction with respect to budget autonomy. If you look at the success of this city in terms of where it is at this stage, we've had, you know, some support for budget autonomy. You know, in the House, some support certainly in the Senate. I think the same thing with legislative autonomy. I think those are the two things that will happen, and I don't think it will take 25 or 30 years. I think that's probably within the next 5 years that we will see that happen. The vote for our Congresswoman, we were so close just a few years ago, when an agreement had been worked out, and I want to thank you know, then Congressman Tom Davis for the work that he did to support the city. An agreement had been reached with Utah. They were essentially a Republican state. They would have gotten an additional representative and a vote with it. We would have gotten a vote, and our Congresswoman would have had a vote. So I think that we'll come back to that again. It's hard to predict what will happen with the statehood because it's such a political issue at this stage. It shouldn't be. But it is a political issue. It proved to be one, obviously, with the last two states that came into the Union, Alaska and Hawaii. But we've got to be able to continue the momentum here in the District of Columbia. Our folks have got to be able to be in this for the long haul, stand up and fight on behalf of democracy. I call the District of Columbia the hypocrisy of democracy. Because really there's so much talk in this city especially about democracy at the federal level, but then it's overlooked when it comes to the people who live in the city.
Congresswoman?
Just quickly, when I was a kid growing up in this town, and I'm a third-generation Washingtonian, there were 800,000 people. I predict that within the next 10 years will be 800,000 again. It will be hard to deny us what the mayor has said in the near term, budget autonomy and legislative autonomy. And you said 40 years. By 40 years, we ought to have statehood.
Absolutely.
Mayor Pratt?
I agree with her. I think in 40 years that, or less, we will have statehood. We must do, as Chairman Tucker said, we have to act like we have that authority. And I do believe that with a younger generation coming here, people who are new to Washington, who've come from places where they were citizens. I think, you know, a lot of us, because we were born into this circumstance, sort of had to get adjusted to it, but they have never had that experience. So I think a collective impatience could accelerate the day when we have full sovereignty and statehood.
And we have a little time left for Chairman Tucker.
On January 2nd, 1975, when we were standing in the cold of the City Hall, District Building, Wilson Building, all those names we've gone through now, my thought was, I looked out over that audience and I thought, how hard we'd fought for home rule. My thought was, how great it is to be standing at the edge of tomorrow, because that's the way I was feeling. In a way, we're still there. My concern would be that we don't become content right now with what we have. Because so we don't have to realize what we can become, and we can become what we want to be if we work at it the way we can. We'll get statehood. We'll get more. We want to be not just a political unity, but we have a great idea, political entity. But we have an opportunity to become the best, the greatest in so many ways, because there's so many assets that we have in the nation's capital.
So for now, the struggle goes on. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
That wraps up today's panel discussion in our special program commemorating the 40th anniversary of Home Rule. Again, this has been a fascinating and very informative discussion, and I want to take this opportunity to thank our distinguished panel again for their participation today. I'm Furman Patterson, and thank you for joining us.